All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep, really deep, into some recent online discussions with Tara Pomeri.
Yeah, she's, a former mainstream journalist now, sharing her take on things over on Substack.
Right, and she's got a pretty big following, especially among those, keeping up with independent journalism.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to uh, really unpack what she's saying, see if we can make sense of it,
Hmm.
and hopefully give you a clearer picture um, of the current political landscape.
That's right. A more nuanced understanding, I'd say.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're focusing on excerpts from Tara's recent online content.
It's a pretty wide range of topics, actually, which is fascinating.
Yeah, we're talking about everything from worries about the Constitution to how election law actually works or doesn't work, as the case may be. And then there's all this talk about the new administration's claims of success early on and some pretty big potential shifts in economic policy, like tariffs, for example.
Lots to cover.
Yeah, a lot to get our heads around. So, okay, let's start with this idea that the Constitution is under attack. Now, both Tara Pomeri and the person she's talking to, they both agree, obviously, that the Constitution is super important.
Absolutely foundational.
Yeah, and I think most of us would probably agree with that. But where they differ is in how serious they think these current threats actually are.
And, it's really interesting to think about the inherent stability of our system, right? I mean, Pomei brings up the fact that to make any fundamental change to the Constitution, you need a two-thirds majority in both the House and the Senate to ratify it,
Yeah.
which is, a pretty high bar.
It's not easy.
No, not at all. So that in itself kind of speaks to how difficult it is to formally change that document.
Right, it's not just a simple majority vote like so many other things. And she also brings up the whole dynamic of political influence, right? Suggesting that the ability of any one person to, just push through legislation like they used to might be fading a bit.
Right.
And she even mentioned some upcoming special elections that could, really give us a sense of where that influence stands right now.
Yeah.
So I think this first part of the conversation really sets up this tension. Shared respect for the Constitution, but different views on how vulnerable it might be at this moment.
For sure.
And I think that's a key takeaway for our listeners too, right? I mean, the formal amendment process, yeah, it's deliberately difficult, but are there other ways that the Constitution's principles can be, I don't know, challenged, or maybe even eroded in practice through political actions or maybe legal interpretations? Something to think about.
Absolutely. Now, moving on, the discussion then shifts to election law, which can be, a pretty complex and sometimes even confusing area.
Yeah.
And they make a really interesting comparison between what might seem like, minor infractions and then actions that could be much more significant.
Right.
So on the one hand, they give the example of someone just, handing a bottle of water to a voter who's standing near a polling place.
Which, can you believe it?
Yeah,
That can actually be seen as breaking electioneering laws.
that's right.
Wild. Right. And then on the other hand, you have something like Elon Musk's thing in Wisconsin, where he was offering people the chance to win $1 million.
Just for registering to vote?
Yeah, just for signing up to vote. And the question that Pomei and her interviewer raise is really important. I mean, how do these seemingly different actions, how do they actually stack up legally?
Yeah.
Like, what's the potential impact of each one, and what's the legal risk?
Right. And here's where the role of the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, comes in. The
Mhm.
Pomei points out that the FEC is often, deadlocked, basically.
Long partisan lines.
Yeah, which makes it really hard for them to properly investigate and enforce potential election law violations.
Yeah.
It's like, imagine a referee who can't make a call because the two teams just can't agree on the rules of the game.
Right. Right.
And this creates a real challenge for making sure that election laws are applied consistently and fairly.
For sure. And to kind of drive this point home, they even brought up some past examples. There were questions about the super PACey supporting Ron DeSantis.
Right.
And even a complaint filed against one of the speakers themselves way back in 2011.
I remember that.
Yeah. And these examples really highlight this recurring pattern of these issues just not being, adequately addressed.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about the bigger picture, right? I mean, if the body that's supposed to oversee campaign finance and election law is constantly, tripping over its own internal disagreements, what does that mean for accountability?
Exactly.
Are these potential violations just slipping through the cracks?
Yeah, it's a good question. Now, they also talked about the possibility of, action at the state level in Wisconsin, specifically regarding Musk's voter registration drive.
Mm-hmm.
But they also raised doubts about whether there would actually be any prosecution.
Pointing to, political considerations and what's called prosecutorial discretion.
Right, which is basically the power of prosecutors to decide which cases they actually want to pursue.
Yeah.
And as they mentioned, prosecutors are often, hesitant to take on cases they don't think they can win.
It's a strategic thing.
Yeah, definitely. So this brings up an important point about how laws are actually applied in the real world, right?
Right.
Even if something technically breaks a law, the decision to prosecute is complicated.
It's had nuanced.
Yeah, it involves, legal interpretation, political realities, and whether they think they can actually win the case.
Makes you think about whether the law is always applied, evenly and fairly, especially in the heated context of elections.
Yeah, definitely food for thought. All right, let's switch gears a bit.
Okay.
The conversation then moves on to the new administration's public statements, especially those claims of early success.
Right.
They talk about Karoline Leavitt
Oh, yeah.
making some pretty bold statements about unprecedented achievements in just the first couple of months of the administration.
Right out of the gate.
Yeah, and Pomeri's reaction is, well, let's just say she's very skeptical.
She didn't hold back.
She called it comical, actually. and the specific example they discuss is pretty telling. It's about a new rule, well, a proposed rule, I should say, concerning deportations. And it apparently uses this 8-point system to assess whether someone might be involved in a gang.
An 8-point system.
Yeah, and get this, the system apparently includes things like tattoos and clothing as criteria.
Seriously?
Yeah, I know. And what's striking is how subjective those criteria seem, right?
Totally.
It makes you wonder how accurately they can actually determine gang membership using things like that.
Yeah, huge potential for bias, I'd say.
Definitely. And the way Leavitt apparently responded to a journalist who questioned this rule is really something else. They describe her communication style as dismissive and even aggressive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like the journalist is basically labeled as fake news just for quoting government documents.
Just for doing their job.
Right, and this really highlights a tactic we see a lot, which is to just immediately discredit any information that challenges the administration's narrative.
Yeah, shut down the conversation before it even starts.
Exactly. And if you think about the audience for this kind of messaging, they specifically mentioned the MAGA movement. This forceful rejection of dissenting voices can be really effective.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because for those who are already inclined to distrust, mainstream media, this approach can just confirm what they already think.
Reinforces their biases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it creates this kind of information bubble where any alternative perspectives are just easily dismissed.
Yeah, dangerous stuff.
Yeah.
Now, Pomeri and her interviewer also analyze Leavitt's ability to frame, potentially controversial issues using really emotionally charged language.
Yeah, they're good at that.
Like, for example, they talk about how she links any questioning of the deportation policy to a lack of patriotism.
And even implies that it means you want to see terrorists harm children.
It's a pretty extreme connection.
It is. But this kind of rhetoric, even if it, oversimplifies complex issues, it's incredibly powerful.
Oh, for sure. It bypasses logic and goes straight for the gut.
Yeah. And what's significant here is the strategic use of these emotional appeals, right? Especially fear.
Right. Tapping into those deep-seated fears people have.
Yeah, like the desire for safety and security.
And using that to avoid having to actually explain or defend the policy itself.
Right. It seems like the administration is more focused on the impact of their message than on the details of the policy itself.
The optics over substance.
Exactly. Okay, moving on. The conversation then gets into the economy.
All right.
Leavitt claims that the economy is doing great, thriving, and it's all thanks to things that were done in the past.
Interesting.
Yeah. But then they bring up some pretty worrying current economic indicators, like reports of GDP going down and inflation going up.
Painting a different picture.
Yeah. They even cite a Fox News poll that showed a majority of Americans actually disapprove of how the economy is being handled right now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's this stark contrast between what the administration is saying and what these indicators are showing.
What people are experiencing.
Right.
Yeah.
And that creates a real disconnect.
Yeah.
It erodes trust when people's lived experiences don't match up with what they're being told.
Absolutely. All right, let's dive into the whole tariff situation.
Yeah, there's talk of a possible across-the-board tariff increase, but Pomey makes a really important point. She says that tariffs aren't usually implemented in such a broad, sweeping way.
Yeah.
It's not like they just slap a flat tax on everything coming in from other countries.
Right.
It's usually much more targeted, industry by industry.
It's a common misconception.
It is.
People think it's much simpler than it actually is.
Yeah, and that's a crucial distinction because the economic impact of tariffs can be very different depending on which industries are targeted and what the specific rates are.
It's a ripple effect.
It is. So a blanket tariff might sound, simple on the surface, but the reality is much more complex. It can affect different sectors of the economy in very different ways.
Yeah.
From manufacturers to consumers. Everyone's potentially impacted.
And they also bring up a critique about the lack of a clear, detailed policy document.
Yeah, like a blueprint of how these tariffs would actually work.
Exactly. And that lack of specifics creates a lot of uncertainty for businesses and for the markets.
They just don't know what to expect.
Right. It makes it impossible to plan.
Exactly. And the suggestion is that this push for tariffs might be more about getting a political win than about, implementing sound economic policy.
It's about the optics again.
Yeah. Now, if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture of global trade, it's incredibly interconnected, right? And focusing only on tariffs as a solution to trade imbalances, it ignores all these other factors at play.
Like currency exchange rates, supply chain dynamics, how competitive different industries are.
It's not that simple.
And the lack of a clear policy can also lead to retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
Which could then hurt American businesses and consumers.
Yeah, exactly. It's a delicate balance.
It is. They even touch on the history of trade deficits, reminding us that this isn't, a new thing.
It's been going on for decades.
Yeah, and that trade relationships are about so much more than just the balance of imports and exports.
It's a complex web.
It is. They even brought up times when European countries were worried about the quality of American products, like whether they met their standards. And what's interesting is that international trade is often based on agreements, regulations, standards that are always evolving. Mm-hmm. So just imposing tariffs without considering all of that, it can disrupt these relationships that have been built up over time.
Yeah.
And it could lead to unintended consequences for the global economy as a whole.
For sure. Unpredictability is never good for the markets.
Nope. And that's what they really highlight. The unpredictable nature of this current approach to tariffs.
Yeah.
They question whether it'll actually be possible to implement these policies effectively and keep the public on board, especially if the economy starts heading towards a recession.
Or if these tariffs are combined with other, unpopular economic measures.
Right, exactly. So this brings up the question of how politically sustainable these policies actually are. I mean, if tariffs lead to higher prices for everyday people, or if they negatively impact American businesses, that support could disappear pretty quickly.
And then it becomes a political liability.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on to some pretty serious claims that were made. There's this assertion, and it's supposedly based on findings by Elon Musk about massive fraud, waste, and abuse within the government.
I've heard about this.
Yeah, and the figures they throw around are just staggering. They range from $500 billion to over $1 trillion.
Wow.
But the conversation very clearly refutes these claims, calling them untrue and saying there's no real evidence to support them.
And that's a really crucial point, because spreading these kinds of claims, especially without, transparent and verifiable evidence, it can really damage public trust in government institutions.
For sure.
And it's important to be able to tell the difference between legitimate concerns about government spending and just, throwing accusations around without any basis.
Right. And these claims are specifically called out as a form of misinformation. And it's interesting because then they suggest that maybe scrutiny should be directed at more specific instances, like taxpayer money that was allegedly spent to help facilitate Trump's golf outings.
Really?
Yeah. and potentially favorable government contracts that were awarded to Elon Musk himself.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So you have this contrast between these broad, unsubstantiated accusations and these more specific areas where there might actually be some cause for concern.
So it's about being precise.
Yeah, and I think what stands out here is how important it is to focus on verifiable facts and specific examples when we're talking about government accountability.
Right. It's not about just making noise.
It's not, because while those big, vague claims might get people's attention, it's the detailed examination of concrete instances, potential mismanagement or conflicts of interest. That's what can actually lead to real transparency and reform.
For sure. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say.
Exactly. And they really emphasize the danger of spreading misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation.
Yeah, all those different flavors of bad information.
Right. And it really underscores the responsibility we all have to be critical of the information we come across, especially online.
Absolutely. And that brings up a crucial question for you, the listener.
How do you evaluate the information you encounter?
Especially online, right?
Yeah.
What steps do you take to figure out if a source is credible?
And if the claims being made are actually accurate.
It's an essential skill these days.
It is. Okay, finally, the conversation touches on some potential political strategies and what the future might hold.
All right.
They mentioned that some advisors might be suggesting taxing the wealthy.
As a way to make up for some of those unfulfilled campaign promises.
Yeah, like the promise not to tax tips or to protect Social Security.
So they're looking for ways to soften the blowback.
Yeah, exactly. And they're also discussing predictions about the Democrats potentially taking back the House in the midterms.
Things could shift.
Yeah, and there's even some speculation, though they think it's unlikely given what's happened in the past about potential impeachment proceedings.
Oh, wow.
They also talk about the mistakes that were made in previous impeachment efforts.
Lessons learned, hopefully.
Yeah, and they stress the importance of sticking to the facts and avoiding anything that could be seen as purely politically motivated.
Sure.
They even bring up that whole boy who cried wolf analogy.
Referencing the public's reaction to the Mueller investigation.
Because if you keep making these big claims that turn out to be, not true, people are going to stop listening.
They'll tune out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think what's insightful here is this reflection on past political events, right? And the lessons that can be learned from them. Maintaining public trust, especially when it comes to serious things like impeachment, requires a very careful approach.
For sure.
Any action has to be based on clear evidence.
Not just political maneuvering.
Exactly. Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We looked at those different perspectives on how stable the Constitution really is, and all the complexities and potential weaknesses of how election law is actually enforced.
Right.
We analyzed the new administration's communication style, which can be pretty assertive at times.
To say the least.
We looked at their economic pronouncements, and we really dug into the nuances of trade policy and those claims of massive financial wrongdoing, which, as we saw, are pretty shaky.
Yeah, lots of ground covered. And the goal was to give you, the listener, a deeper, more nuanced understanding of what's really going on with these issues.
Right, because by analyzing these conversations, we can get a clearer picture of the debates and the tensions that are shaping, our political reality right now. And we're trying to offer a level of detail that you might not get from just, skimming the headlines.
Exactly.
So on that note, here's a final thought to leave you with.
Given all these different narratives flying around.
Yeah, and often coming from sources with very different agendas. What's our responsibility as individuals, to figure out what information we can actually trust?
And then to engage in thoughtful, respectful dialogue with people who might see things completely differently than we do.
It's a big question, but I think it's one worth wrestling with.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in hearing more from Tara Pomeri, her Substack is called The Red Letter, and you can also find it on YouTube.
Yeah, she's got a lot of in-depth analysis and commentary over there.
Worth checking out.
Yeah, definitely. All right, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
See you next time.